how this book got written. I grew up in the Stillaguamish Valley in Snohomish County, Washington State. There's an attachment, which many people who have spent time in that part of the country know. It's almost a religious thing, and I don't want to get any further into it than that, except there is a deep attachment to those hills and mountains, and in particular that valley. I went to the University of Chicago, kind of a fluke, because Norman MacLean, the author of A River Runs Through It, was teaching at the University of Chicago, and he demanded that kids from small Western schools be recruited. So I was one of the recruits of Norman MacLean. After I graduated, it wasn't that long after I graduated, I had gotten my hands on history, an old history of Snohomish and Skagit counties. And reading that history, I came across this episode. One of the first pioneers, as it were, in the valley had committed this terrible crime. I'd be giving away too much of the story to tell you what it is right now, but it was a terrible, terrible crime. And I was moved by that, and I thought, well, this was, I should say, 50 years ago. What would it mean to have such a kind of a stain on the land, and what kind of person would redeem that? And that's when, we're talking like back in 72, 73, something like this. This guy popped into my mind. Is lean-faced, lean person, always seemed to be wearing this gray hoodie with the hood up. His eyes were unusual. I mean, they were blue, but sometimes they were gray, and sometimes they were the color of water flowing under ice. Just that sort of a striking, changeable nature. But Arne didn't talk, which made writing his story a challenge. I had many characters surrounding Arne because the story really began before there was a time in a mythic period and right up to the present day. And rather than try to force a narrator who would explain everything that went on into everybody's head, I had this sort of Rashomon moment where the characters, if the story would be told, the characters would step forward and look the reader in the eye and tell them what of the story of Arne Vitner that they knew. Some of them were quite frustrated in their lives by this fact that they knew there was something horrible had happened, but they didn't know what it was. So we're going to be hearing from different characters right now. Ben Clarvosser, the author of a self-published book, The Death of Arne Vitner. Ben was a realtor who helped Arne's brother-in-law, Gunnar Hagen, to sell Arne's field to a real estate developer. Some say that was a forced sale. Also, Matt Haugen, Gunnar's son, who came back from Vietnam in 1968, in June of 1968, and not in very good mental health. We'll be hearing from Ben Clarvosser's granddaughter, Kylie Clarvosser, who kept Ben's books on a shelf in her flower shop in town. So we'll begin with our first segment, which is Ben Clarvosser is talking to us. It's the prologue. And Ben is writing in The Death of Arne Vitner book. People have asked me, what did I know about Arne Vitner? There were rumors, sometimes outright gossip, about the circumstances of his death. I understand. Arne was an intensely private man. Those closest to him only knew some of the story. Even I, who made it my business to learn all that could be learned, have come to understand a fraction of the mosaic that was the life of Arne Vitner. This much you can be sure of. Arne came and went silently, carrying a burden on behalf of all of us living in this valley. Some people called him a god, but he was a man, the son and grandson of immigrants who came here as we all did. They took land, they lived on it. If the Vitners were different from their neighbors, it was because they knew what most people forgot, that the land wasn't simply something filed away on paper in the county clerk's office, but a place of promises made and hearts broken. In a time before any of us even knew the name of this valley and the river with an incomprehensible name that dominated it. I say dominated in the past tense because when Arne died, when the events around his death occurred, something was broken here, something that would never be put back together again. It isn't the nature of rivers to shape the land and the lives of those living on its banks. The Vitners, more than any family I knew in my long life, struggled with the river, struggled until the very end. To understand what made Arne the way he was, you should know who his people were and where they came from. Because even then, in the old country, there was a mark on them. There was a talent, or a gift, or a burden. All right, there's our introduction to Arne Vitner. Now we go to a section that is more writings from Ben in his book. But this time he's retelling a story that Arne had told him many years before, when Arne was just a boy, 10, 12 years old. At that time, Ben was a young man himself. Ben was fishing on the river, and Arne and this family friend, a mysterious sort of woman, Mary, came out of the brush and confronted Ben Clarvosser and wanted him to write down the story that Arne was going to tell. And so Ben consented, and it ended up in his book. Arne told me of the night Susanna turned up missing from the Lutheran women's gathering at 13 Glacier. A commotion downstairs woke him. He opened his eyes and stared at the rafters, listening to what sounded like women weeping. His father's voice repeated a question over and over. Was a stranger there? Did a stranger talk to her? Arne slipped downstairs in his pajamas, disheveled women with pale, tear-stained faces. Mrs. Haugen's rimless glasses were askew on her plump face. Gone, she sobbed. We couldn't find her. Ivar's face flushed red, then it went white. This stranger, was it a woman? Marla Haugen wrung her hands. I don't know. I didn't see anyone, but somebody said, maybe there was a woman. Where? Ivar demanded. Was it anywhere near the river? One of the women spoke up. It was near the footbridge, but I didn't get a good look at the woman. Ivor looked down and to the side. He caught sight of Arne. To Arne, his face looked like a mask with deep black eye holes. This is not fair. Ivor's whisper cut through the hubbub like a hand slap. I have kept our part of the bargain. He turned to Marla. This is your husband's doing. You tell Max that this is on his conscience. The women fell silent. Even Marla had no words to say. Let me take Arne across the river to our house, she said at last. He can stay in Gunnar's room. Ivor left the house and drove away to the night. Marla bundled Arne up and took him to the bridge in town and back up the other side of the river to the Hagen farm. In the morning, a search party went up 13 Glacier, but no trace of Susanna was found. Other people stopped looking, Arne told me on the riverbank, but Father and I went back again and again. Arne only knew that his mother had kissed him early one morning and then was whisked away like a straw carried off on the current. After the tragedy, Ivor kept his thoughts to himself, but each year on the anniversary of Susanna's disappearance, he had taken his son up to Mount 13, where they tramped the meadows and stony scree in the hope that Susanna would step from behind the granite walls that hemmed in the area, delivered up by the implacable force that had taken her in the first place. The last time Ivor and Arne searched for Susanna, Arne woke to the sound of the Ford coughing to life down in the yard. He looked out his bedroom window and saw the haze of exhaust rising behind the lilacs that grew beside the porch. The outline of Ivor's head and shoulders emerged from underneath the truck's hood, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. A weight of dread pressed on Arne. Why did you have to go away? He asked silently. There was no answer. Only the buzzing silence in the room. Arne had to go. His father was waiting. He went down the narrow back stairs and out the screen door. Ivor had climbed into the truck. In the low morning light, Arne thought his profile was sharp, like a cartoon figure, a flat person with everything pressed out of him except the grief. Arne climbed into the passenger side, slammed the door, jiggled the door handle, then slammed it again. Boy and father looked at each other. Max Hagen wants us to work on that road, Arne ventured. Max Hagen doesn't own us, Ivor answered. Quite yet. Ivor gripped the gear shift knob and forced the gears to engage. Arne wanted to be left at home, but it was futile to beg. The ride passed in silence, down the gravel road to town, then back up the South Fork to the road that ran past Stone Falls to the National Forest, recently paved with asphalt, thanks to Max Haugen's Good Roads Committee. Arne hoped Ivor would stop at the falls. He enjoyed standing on the spot where granite cliffs forced the river into a hairpin turn before leaning back to allow the current to widen into a series of loops and rapids that led the way to the lower valley. The falls was where the river expended the fury which it carried all the way down from the headwaters. For a moment, it looked like Ivor was going to give Arne his chance to see his favorite spot. He downshifted and steered the truck off at the packed earth turnout that served as a parking area for the falls overlook. They stopped. Dust rose from the rear wheels and drifted toward the river's edge. Don't get out, Ivor ordered. Wait here. Arne watched his father step down from the running board and stride across the hard dirt. Ivor's lean frame moved with a high-stepping gait, like he was unsure of his footing. He entered a gap between two elderberry bushes and was lost to sight. The Ford's engines ticked, cooling slowly. A log truck howled by with a gust of wind. Why did you go away? Arne asked the silence. You could have come home to say goodbye. It was a question he had asked for the past 3 years. Arne knew his mother was dead. People died. Mothers died. Pastor Carlson had explained this, and Arne understood. Ivor's mother had drowned in the river when her canoe overturned. Other mothers died in childbirth, from the flu, in car wrecks. But nobody's mother stepped off into space. Arne squirmed on a broken spring in the seat of the Ford. Ivor had been gone some time and is beginning to worry. What would he do if both persons walked off? If both parents walked off? When his father stepped from behind the mounds of greenery, he was not alone. A large man followed him. Arne studied the stranger as he approached. It was dark. His face wasn't round. It was square and irregular. The first draft of a head, like it had been hewn from a block in a hurry. His brows were heavy, a lateral ridge of bone hiding deep-set eyes. His black hair was long and matted. Twigs and dried leaves decorated it, like he had just risen from the ground. The man's old-fashioned canvas pants and wool jacket over a torn and stained jersey made him look like a railroad bum. The stranger paused outside the passenger door of the pickup. His shoulders and chest filled Arne's field of vision. Ivor opened the driver's door and climbed in. Scoot over, he ordered. Arne scrunched across the seat, hitting his knee on the gear shift knob. The man eased his bulk in beside him. He had trouble shutting the door. You have to slam it, Arne suggested. Black eyes looked down the sloping planes of the man's face and studied the boy beside him. Or if I break it, he asked in a voice that rumbled. It's already broken. The starter whined, jolted over a broken tooth, then whined again, jerking the reluctant motor back to life. Ivor gunned it and pulled onto the blacktop. As they drove, granite escarpments broke through the veil of trees covering the upper slopes beyond the river. Eagles wheeled across the cliffs. The Ford moved like an insect across the floor of the valley, inching alongside the river, young hair and growing younger with each passing mile. The men said nothing to each other. Arne's eyes drooped, and he fell asleep. He awoke when they slowed and jolted off the edge of the blacktop onto a gravel drive. Even behind closed eyes, Arne knew this place. It was the starting point for their searches. The drive opened onto a parking lot covered with crushed quartz, which reflected an improbable white glare, like it was somebody's idea what a fancy parking lot was supposed to look like, even though nothing like this existed in the normal world. The lot was hemmed in by a white board fence, like no fence Arne had ever seen, except in horse farms in the movies. An archway indicated the entrance to the lodge in letters carved from wood and painted white with the words, Welcome to 13 Glacier, birthplace of the river. The same powdery white stones covered the walk leading from the archway to the lodge, a large alpine building with the peaks of many dormers marching along the roof line. Ivor led the way to the arch, but the stranger stopped and pointed to the letters. What does that say? He asked. He seemed frightened. Arne read the words. What name does it say? Arne shrugged. It just says river. The giant shifted to turn his head from side to side. He seemed to have no neck. Corded muscles like bone ridges sloped from his shoulders to his ears. He clenched his fists and jabbed a knotted finger at the sign. Why do they speak of her at this place? She wasn't born here. It doesn't mean that, Arne explained. It's just a sign. People put them up to show they own the place. The stranger nodded. Signs. People put them up. He peered beyond the lodge and its green lawns. Arne followed his gaze at the ragged summit of Mount 13, thrusting up from the rear of the property like it had grown there overnight. He looked to the left where the gray escarpment began, the looming wall that shielded the glacier from view. The man's leathery skin wrinkled into a squint. His concentration was focused on the back side of the great col. Over there. He climbed over the fence and started toward the cliffs. Arne ran for Ivar. He found his father at the rear of the lodge, talking to one of the workers. He's gone, he panted. Toward the ice caves. The worker tilted his cap, wiping his brow. Be careful in them caves. Ice and rocks come down all the time. You can't trust them places. They're pretty, but he held his hand parallel to the ground and waggled it, indicating uncertainty. They caught up with a man on the open field of stones before the ice caves. It was dark in spite of the light-filled morning. Schist granite ramparts reared up and eclipsed the lower quadrant of the sky. A cold breath crept over the boulders, as though the stones exhaled an essence of winter. Summer came late to the territory of 13 Glacier. Arne shivered in his jacket. Why here, he wondered. He tried to imagine his mother in this place on a clear summer afternoon, standing in this rugged scree in her green wool jacket, quietly composed, then rising above the earth, growing smaller and smaller into the blue of heaven. Water ran everywhere, around and under the rocks. Arne looked down. A boy's face looked back up at him. The boy resembled him, but his face was gray. His expression was solemn, and his lips parted as if he were about to speak. His eyes were filled with sadness, more than a boy could possibly hold. Where is Mama? Arne asked the boy. The boy shivered as the water rippled, shifting the surface of the upside-down world. Arne! Ivar was a diminished figure on the far side of the boulder field. He beckoned. Arne left the boy and picked his way over sharp stones to his father. Ivar waved to him from the foot of a high wall of white, the calved out side of the mountain embraced long ago by ice. The glacier created this wall and faded, leaving ice caves, broken rock, and water. Ivar put a hand on his son's shoulder. He pointed to the mouth of the cave nearby, its arch defined by blue ice. Stones and grit were embedded in its surface, as if it were part of a foundation poured by haphazard workmen. He went in there, Ivar whispered. His breath was a ghost plume in the air. He said there's something about Mama. His voice broke. Susanna. Something she did, or something. Arne's hand found Ivar's thin, hard fingers. They were cold as the ice of the cave, but the grip was tight. Susanna was gone. They had to stand together. The man emerged from the darkness like a bear leaving his winter cave. He squinted in the sunlight, moving his head from side to side. The expression on his face was watchful and withdrawn at the same time, an animal accustomed to the solitude of empty spaces. When he focused his dark eyes on the Vitners, they registered recognition, and his gaze slid off to a dark verge of spruce in the middle distance. Without making any comments, he stumbled past them, cutting a ragged arc across the field of boulders toward the Forest Service trail. The search was over. Arne and Ivar had no choice but to follow. Silence filled the cab of the Ford as Ivar drove back down the road toward the falls. The man's scent was overpowering. Arne thought it smelled like wet fur. The giant looked out the window. His hair was long and black and stiff, like a kind of woven fabric. They went up this valley to look for gold, he said, but there never was any gold. They made wooden houses, but they all burned down. They even built roads and railroads, but you wash them out every time. There's that lodge up there, Ivor answered. It is made of wood. It will burn. And then no one will ever know people were here. Ivor turned his head to look at the man. Arne felt trapped between the two poles of a magnet. The hair rose on the back of his neck. You would know, Ivor said. The stranger turned his head slowly and stared at Ivor, then looked away again. I'm not to blame for all that has happened. Ivor's voice was sharp and flinty, like stones grinding together. Father did nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong, and we shouldn't have to suffer. A hand like a leather paw gripped Arnie's forearm. It wasn't your grandpa's fault. He was a good man. I always liked him. All you Vitners are good people. Arne gaped. My grandfather? You knew him? The boy doesn't know the story, Ivor put in sharply. There isn't any need. Ivor drove off the road and stopped the truck. They were back at the parking area by the falls. Shadows lengthened in the valley, though the slopes looming overhead remained golden. They sat. Arne had the dream feeling that Susanna was about to appear, that any moment she would step from behind the painted screen of this world, and everything would be good again. My daughter, the giant rumbled. That one. He made a movement with his rock-like chin toward the passenger window, and Arnie's eye followed, although there was nothing to see except dusty gravel and a wall of vegetation. You know her. Ivor sighed. He nodded slowly. His expression was already tight, became more drawn. She made a lot of trouble because of your land, the man continued. Down to this day. Down to this day, Ivor echoed. The man opened the door and lumbered across the parking area without looking back. Well, that is a little background on Arne Vitner's childhood. Let's see. What have we read here? All right. Now, we've come along the timeline here. You know, the 30s, when there was a big flood in the river, and on up to 68. But the justification for what happened in 68 when Gunnar Hagen succeeded in forcing Arne to sell the field to the developer was something that was grinding on Gunnar Hagen for a long time. Gunnar was a good friend of Arne's. They were boyhood friends. Gunnar himself really disliked his father, Max, who was somewhat of a bastard. In Gunnar's mind, there was something wrong, that somehow the Hagens had got control of the field in 1919, and they shouldn't have had it. And then in 1935, when the river flooded and took it back over to the Vitner side, Max really went over across the river and paid Ivor again in a very, very humiliating way. And Gunnar could never really reconcile himself to that. And he sort of struggled in his own mind for years, his own feelings for years about Arne should have the field, but Arne wasn't using the field. Arne was really messing up by staying poor and not using the field. But when Arne disappeared just before his death, there was rumors that maybe Arne was killed by someone. The town chief of police, John Padridge, he might have suspected, but he had to ask Gunnar, did you kill Arne? And in Gunnar's letters, which his son Max had kept all these years, letters and various writings and things in a box. And in that box was a letter, evidently, that Gunnar had never sent to John Padridge, but he saved the letter. And this is Gunnar's attempt to explain sort of the background of what all went on in 1935, why I couldn't have killed Arne, but in the end, as you'll see, Gunnar isn't eloquent enough to make the point. In the book, I shall say later on, the day before Arne dies, Gunnar does explain himself sufficiently to John. So this is the letter. It's a handwritten document in a manila envelope in Gunnar's bold box. June 15th, 1968. John, yesterday you asked me if I was the one who killed Arne. Before you think I was so mad at Arne Vitner, I'd see him dead. You need to understand that it was all about the field. Arne was like a brother to me. The field, the way he and Ivor felt about it, the way my father thought about it. Things happened I saw with my own eyes. Other things that Alma said, that Alma is Max's sister and Arnie's wife. That Alma said, and I believed her. I just want you to understand. I know this is hard. I'm sorry. You remember September of 1935? It rained every day. The low fields filled with water. Cows got stuck. We had to get them out up to the barn. Sometimes we had to use the tractor. I was supposed to cut the hay one last time, but that was a disaster. Creeks filled their banks and the river followed. The river turned into a monster. The county engineer stationed men and equipment at the bridges to pull out any logs that might build up around the supports. Upriver, we were on our own. For days, we watched the water level creep up the banks of Father's prized bottomland. He fumed when the current rose around the oxbow and dug at the clay on the upstream edge of the field. It looked like it might even overflow the connection at the bottom of the road. That's when Father drove to town to see the county engineer. Later in the day, a green county truck arrived at our place. A Caterpillar D4 dozer was on the trailer behind it. I doubt that the engineer wanted to lend out public equipment, but Father had the county commission in his pocket. He signed some paperwork, scrambled into the seat. The cat roared and spat out black exhaust. He looked down at me. Take the big truck and pick up those two over there. He pointed across the river to the Vitner farm. Tell them I need them over here now. Stop at the co-op on your way back through town and load up with the sandbags I put in the warehouse. I was 12. I never I'd never even driven the flatbed past the barnyard, but I knew better than to argue. I went to the machine shed and fired up the old International. After a lot of grinding and lurching, I figured out how to get it into third gear in low range, which I guessed was enough to give me 20 miles an hour on the open road. At town, they were letting one vehicle to cross the bridge at a time. Men were hard at it with a drag line and a donkey engine, grappling snags as they plowed into the bridge pilings. The rain beat down. When I got to the Vitner place, the entrance to the drive was so narrow, I was afraid to take the truck down it. So I left it in the middle of the road and walked the rest of the way. You remember how the Vitner Drive used to be? All brush and water in the ruts. I was soaked by the time I got to Ivor's yard. The porch steps were black with wet. The windows were dark. The place looked deserted. I knocked and yelled until I heard footsteps. It was Arne. We stared at each other. I hadn't seen him since early summer. I didn't know what to say. You remember Ivor's kitchen? Small wood stove, a plain table and cane-bottom chairs, a narrow shelf for the kerosene lamps, and a handful of dishes. Ivor came in from the hall. He smiled. Now then, Gunnar, how? You're out on a bad day. Max wants you, I blurted out, across the river. It was dark in there. After a long pause, Ivor asked, what would your father want of me? I stammered. I think the river. What about the river? Ivor's voice was sharp. He's got a bulldozer. He wants us to bring sandbags from town. Ivor nodded. He glanced toward Arne. He wants us to put sandbags down on the river. I shrugged. Fighting with the river. Ivor shook his head. No good will come of that. My eyes were nearly on a level with Ivor's, but it felt like he was speaking to me from way up near the ceiling. My father owned that land down there. You know that? When he first came here with you Haugans, he tried to make use of the field before the flood of 1919. His eyes were shaded, but they had a gleam to them. We paid dearly for that. I was in a panic. The thought of facing father, I can't go back. No, you can't. Tell your father he shouldn't do this thing. I'll go with him, Arne said. I'll help him. He'll get whipped if nobody comes with him. Ivor wrung his hands. This flood will be worse than 1919. I'm sure of it. You can't be out there with no one but Max. He was quiet. We'll come, he said. Finally, we'll help you with the sandbags, but we won't go down into that field. The Vitners followed me into town. Between that old fort and the International, we hauled a quarter of the sandbags from the co-op to our place. We spent the day shuttling sandbags from town and stacking them beside the road down into the bottomland. Father stayed up on the D4, gouging clay from the base of the bank and pushing it to the river's edge to make a loose dike. The water kept rising. The clay became saturated. Late afternoon, it began to slump where the current was strongest. Father wheeled the cat around and clanked back up the road to the upper farm. The Vitners and I were unloading the last of the sandbags. Father looked down on us like a general reviewing his troops from his horse. Put the bags on the back on the flatbed, he ordered. Stack them 3 high so it doesn't get overloaded. I'll wait for you down in the field. He pointed to me. Get the heavy chain from the shed. We'll hook it to the cat and use it to pull the truck. 6 men came in from neighboring farms. They helped to load the sandbags onto the International. I got behind the wheel. and allowed the truck to creep towards the steep slope of the road. Father sat on the cat watching me. The sight of the river tearing by was not as frightening to me as the sight of his face. I was soaked. I'd been soaked all day. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. The rain never stopped. The flood roared like a locomotive. At the bottom of the road, the men ran the chain from the International's bumper to the eyelet in the rear of the cat. Father climbed down to check the connections. "Where's Ivor and the kid?" demanded. I turned away. They went home. Home? You let them go home? Here it comes, I thought. I tried not to flinch. Ivor said he was only staying to unload the bags. He didn't want to work down here. Max squeezed both hands in a fist. "Damn the Vitners," he bellowed. "They're lazy, that's what. All that business with this field, all them being superstitious and not wanting to work when the going gets tough." He glared at me. "What are you standing around for? Get back up there and steer." You can't really control a heavy truck while it's being dragged by a bulldozer across a waterlogged field in a driving rain. At dinner time, Mother brought down sandwiches and coffee, which we ate standing in the headlights of the truck. Mother and Father stood off to one side. I could tell they were arguing, but couldn't hear the words. From the way she waved her arms, it looked like Mother was trying to get Father to leave off and go back to the house. She gave up. On her way past the truck, she put her hand on my arm. "Stay away from the water," she said. "When the river breaks through, run, no matter what your father does." We formed a line and passed heavy sandbag from hand to hand. Father stood on the earthen berm, sunk to his ankles in muddy clay. We emptied the truck bed, then it was time to repeat the trip behind the dozer back to the road. We loaded again from the wall of bags beside the drive and went back to do it all over again. The machine slid and bumped to the river, back to the river, and the men reformed the line, then back for more bags. Night came, and the darkness was complete except for the headlights. Away in the black across the valley, I could make out a dot of light on Ivor Vitner's porch. The men staggered. 2 of them left. Father cursed. We kept adding sandbags to the dike, and it seemed we were gaining the upper hand until around midnight. The rain let up, and a warm wind began to blow up the valley. Down in the sound, the tide was in. After that, the river rose faster than ever. Water slapped at the sand over the sandbags at the spot where the dike met the bank, the place where Father had shoved the most clay and dirt. The remaining men looked at the black water sliding over all our efforts, shook their heads, and left. The bed of the International was empty. There was nothing to do but watch water creep toward the yellow light the headlights set out into the night. Even with the others gone, there was no giving up the fight. I climbed into the International and waited for Father to begin towing. It was a difficult business this time. The ground was dug up by the cat tracks, and the truck slewed from side to side. The road up the bank to the upper farm was so slick, Father had to get behind me and push the International with the blade of the cat. There were enough sandbags for one last load. I was so tired I fell twice. The trip back to the levee seemed to last forever. It began to rain again, harder than ever. The field was ankle deep in water. I had to scramble up the dike at the spot nearest the bank, pushing the bags above my head to get them to Father. The truck slowly emptied. The rain fell. The river roared all around us. Father kept shouting to hurry up, hurry up. I wrestled the bag to the level of his ankles, and I looked out across the top of the berm. Black water was everywhere. It flowed straight at me. I leaned back and fell. Father started to swear, then stopped. The dike failed. The place closest to the high bank washed out with a horrible sucking sound. The river slid over the sandbags. Before I could make it to my feet, I was underwater. Father yanked me up by my collar. Run, he said. The river beat us to the road, but a tree washed up there, which gave us a kind of bridge to the higher ground. When I got up to the barnyard, I went down on one knee. Below me, the river twisted like a living creature with black and shiny skin bristling with tree roots. It flowed where I'd never seen it flow before, right along the base of the bank, like it intended to eat the field and rise up and destroy everything in the valley. Father stayed on the edge of the slope. He shook his fist at the river. You fucking bitch, he yelled. You goddamn worthless ditch of shit water. Thief, that's what you are. Thief back then, thief now. Go back to fucking hell and rot there. I stood up, turned my back on him, and made my way to the house. I don't know, John. I think I had to give up writing this on this thing. I wanted to give you the background to what happened the day after the flood, because I thought something Alma said to me down in that field might give you an idea of what went on back then. But it's all nonsense. It's getting late. Whatever happened to Arnie? Why he has disappeared? It's too late to change that. Selling the field will be a good thing. All the things that went on with the river will be in the past, and they won't matter anymore. And now, I don't even know what I'm talking about. Gunner. We had a very short piece. And I'm wondering if maybe I should stop there. Are we all getting kind of worn out?
I'm wondering
Okay.
if anyone has any questions.
Yes. Let me finish this one short piece.
Okay.
This is the day in June of 1968, the day before the field was to be sold. And for various reasons, the sale was going to have to be held around a card table in the middle of the field. So Billy Slocum, the young fellow who had grown up with Matt Haugen and Karen Vitner, was to give him the task of bringing the chairs and the table down to the field. And he also had Matt Haugen with him, although Matt wasn't much good because Matt was just worse than ever. I mean, he was just barely maintaining himself. He had one traumatic experience after another. And he told Billy, as they sat on the porch of Arnie's house on that day in June, Mary told me, had something she wanted me to tell you. Billy, who was a person that never really did know what the hell was going on, he didn't know Mary. He had no even way to conceive that Mary had just taken Matt back into time and up the river. And it was clear that Matt was out of his mind, but he didn't know anything about Mary. He didn't really even know her. He'd heard her name. So Matt began to tell this thing that Mary wanted Billy to know, because Mary thought that Billy ought to know it. Matt began in a funny sing-song voice, like he memorized some old song. I gotta put my glasses up, if you don't mind. There is a father and a daughter. They meet on the far side of the falls. You have to stop what you're doing, the father says. You're hurting people who haven't done anything to you. This is my valley, the daughter says. You had me agree once, but now I do what I want. This isn't your valley anymore, the father says. It belongs to those people living there now. They mean nothing to me. I can kill them all. The father laughs, but it is a sad laugh. You can't. Look at me. You see how small I am? Before long, I will be so small, they won't be able to find me. You'll forget who you are. In winter and summer, people will come to look at you. They won't be fearful. You'll be just something to look at when there is nothing better to do. That's a lie, the daughter shouts. You want me to shrink to nothing and be like you? All the land, the rocks, the trees, and the sand, and the dirt belong to me. Father shakes his old head. You own nothing now. Look at the land below you. All those lines. They draw those lines to tell each other what they own. Those lines cut here and there like knives, and you can't stop them. I'll wash the ball into the sea. The father turns away so his daughter won't see how sad he is. You can only wash the dead into the sea. You can only drown them with water that no longer exists. That is about as much as one could stand listening.
That's great.
So, any questions?
Yeah. There's one online. Anyone? Okay, we'll start here. As someone asked, I'm fascinated by the reference to Ivar's superstition and belief in things unseen and that thread in the book. Does this connect to the old country and family beliefs there? I know the indigenous Sami of Norway are similar in many ways to First Nations in the US and their beliefs. It feels connected, perhaps.
I think this is possibly Marcia Jacobson speaking to me now, my old debate partner from high school.
That's awesome. That's funny.
Yes, Marcia, it goes back, but not to the Sami. In that prologue, actually Ben Klarvasser goes on to talk about the last days of the Vitners in the area of Stavanger, Norway. On the Vitner farm was on the Figgjo Elva, and the Gunnar family farm was on the stars of Story Stokovatnet. Although Arne's mother came from the woods east of Grutevatnet, and everyone knows as Per Vitner, Einar Vitner's grandmother, Besti would say, nothing good ever came from those woods out east of Grutevatnet.
So my question is, do you have Norwegian ancestors?
No, nothing. No, well, when I grew up, it was pretty much a Norwegian and Swedish culture there. And some of the people that I really looked up to the most, that would be Bill Tweet, for those of you listening, and Elon Holm, although he was Finnish. So, yeah, I do have parts of the thing in Norwegian.
Oh, really? Wow. And you speak it? Did you have to research that?
I had to research it, but I don't speak it. I had some parts gone over by a professor at Pacific Lutheran University that Marcia had introduced me to.
Very nice. Very nice. Any more questions? It sounds I haven't read it. It sounds very complex. And I'm wondering how you kept all those threads straight in your mind when you wrote it.
It took a long time, 50 years.
Oh my gosh.
But I started to be able to sort this out by putting the various characters' narratives or narratives associated to various characters on 3x5 cards and then pinning them in rows on the wall. And it just could struggle with this whole narrator thing. The universal narrator, the omniscient narrator just didn't seem to be cutting it. I just couldn't seem to make it work. And then it's sort of, you remember Rashomon, the Japanese story, where the people all are at a trial and each person has his own version of what had occurred. So it was sort of like that. A bit of inspiration from Lawrence Durrell in his Alexandria Quartet, which kind of helped me to begin to understand that, you know, you can't package everything under one narrative sometimes. Sometimes story has to be told for the point of view of more than one person. The style itself, I kind of stole from Joseph Conrad. If you remember, Conrad's favorite character, Captain Marlowe, retired sea captain Marlowe, who would start spinning out the yarn, and then after he'd gotten into it sometime, then Marlowe's voice kind of fades away, and then you're all in the thick of it, like in Lord Jim, The Heart of Darkness, several of Conrad's works were kind of had that conceit of a narrator who kind of fades into the story. So that's kind of what helped me move along, and keeping it all straight was a nightmare. This is true.
Because you started before, you used a typewriter at the beginning. There was no word processing, so you couldn't. Back and forth.
That's just true.
How many devices have you used while you were writing this book? Do you remember them all?
Well, of course, in the early 70s, I just wrote on paper,
Right.
and I had gotten from somewhere big sheets of newsprint, like, I don't like that. So I had to write all this stuff on these sheets. I've still got them somewhere. And then it was typewriter, and then
What kind of typewriter?
it was a Royal Electric. And then I got my first word processor. It was like, you were like a tiny thing, maybe 4. We just got, no, it was somewhere 3 or 4. We were in Seattle.
What processor was that?
It doesn't exist anymore. It fell out of existence, right? It was called a Piper. It had a keyboard, but it didn't come with a screen. You had to get your own monitor and plug it into the thing, and it to save everything is on these flop.
The big ones.
The big ones. Oh God, yeah. Yeah, it's like the history of novel writing in the latter half of the 20th century involved in
Every
this.
method.
There's another question from this is from Elizabeth. It says, cheers to Bill Tweet.
Betsy, it's Bill Tweet.
Great reading. Glad I was able to join. Do you place importance on the influence of the native residents who lived in the valley prior to the arrival of Arne and other European settlers?
I do. Although I should say, for my Pacific Northwest friends, I went to great lengths not to identify any of the characters or any of the stories or details with the culture of the Salish people. I am horrified at the possibility that someone might say this was expropriation, but all the stories about the old times, I made it myself. And the characters, I hope, are unique enough that it won't seem that I have tried to swipe anything from the Stillaguamish people or the other Salish people in the area. That's my sister Betsy.
Thanks, Aunt Betsy.
Like a family reunion here.
Okay, last question. What's the next book?
I'm working on a set of 4, a quartet,
Oh, wow.
kind of more after the Alexandria Quartet, a science fiction book. And so there's 4 main characters, and each character will have its own novel. And something else has kind of broken into my consciousness, possibly due to the fact that now I'm employed as a part-time driver of children and amuser of 5-year-olds, that I have more time to think about these things. This idea, this thing that had cropped to my mind back in '71 has been bothering me again. It's something about Emperor Alphonse Splendido I retired, who was an emperor of an empire called Tlon and Ukbar, which are somewhere Azerbaijanish back in the way oldie times. And some of you who follow along with me on Facebook, I might have actually put some of that stuff up on there, as strange as it is. There's that, and I'm kind of work a little on the quartet and a little on the Alphonse Splendido thing.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. Thank you so much for this.
Another 50 years.
Yeah, I hope so. I just say thank you.
Well, thank you all for
People clap on the internet.
back in Washington.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone's saying bravo. Thank you.